Just a little housekeeping here. I'll be right with you. One of the quotes I have from David Green was from an email as we were talking about what to do at the conference and so on, and some of the proposals that he had thrown out and so on, options. One of them was, as he said rather simplistically, how to read both parts of your Bible. So I thought I would go with the simplistic pattern there, and how to read at least part of your Old Testament texts and so on, and that we would focus there. And so our first session is figuring it out, the Old Testament writer's intention, figuring it out, the Old Testament writer's intention. So let me just begin by saying that intention in the biblical texts, and I'm looking especially, most of my samples probably will come from Old Testament narrative and so on, but intention seems to be very important. I had a friend from Scotland that sent me a story about a 6-year-old that goes to the hospital with her mother to visit her grandpa. And when they get to the hospital, the little girl runs ahead of her mother and bursts into Grandpa's room. "Grandpa, Grandpa," she says excitedly, "as soon as my mother comes into the room, make a noise like a frog." "What?" said her grandmother. "Make a noise like a frog, because Mommy said that as soon as you croak, we're all going to Disneyland." Now, there's a little conflict there between literalistic interpretation and colloquial interpretation, but I'm pretty sure that Grandpa discerned the intention reasonably well. Intention is important. So intended meaning is important, it matters, and even those who say intended meaning doesn't matter expect you to understand their intended meaning when they say intended meaning doesn't matter. But worrying about the intention of biblical writers and what they write is not cool today. It's not uptown, as we say. That's always a little embarrassing, if it's not cool. I remember when I was a child, this was early 1950s, but we had about the oldest car in town. It was a 1940 Chevy. And my dad always had trouble, standard shift of course, always had trouble keeping a gear shift handle on the gear shift. There were these neat white plastic things, but they always broke for some reason. And finally, in disgust, he took about an 8 inches that he sawed off the end of a long-handled spade, shovel. He bored a hole in the butt end of it, and he crammed it on the gear shift, and you had 8 inches of shovel handle. If you're really concerned about aesthetics, that really puts a nice decor on the interior of your vehicle. It just wasn't cool at all. And that's the way people look in large part at worrying about the intention of the biblical writers or the biblical text today. It's just not uptown. In fact, my previous, one of the titles I was thinking of using for this was a little exercise in dinosaur hermeneutics. Now, hermeneutics obviously is the way you interpret, and a way of interpretation and so on, and dinosaur means, well, obsolete, backward, and that sort of thing. And that's the way it seemed, because the chick interest today is reader response interpretation, where what matters is what the text does to you, not what it was meant to say. Phil Long gives a sample of that in an example he gives. John is putting Mary on a plane, and he says to her, "Don't forget to write." When she returns, he says to her, "Why didn't you write me?" And Mary says, "Oh, the speech act we shared didn't mean that I should write to you. That's not the way I took it. I did write a few things, a shopping list, a letter to my mother, my name on the hotel register." In other words, what matters to Mary is how the words affected her, how she decided to take it. But we want to go back to the dinosaur situation and worry about the intention of biblical texts, and especially Old Testament texts. So when it comes to a biblical text, I think it's important that the text affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, that the text affect me, but I should seek to receive that text in line with the biblical writer's intent. But then that can be difficult at times to answer the question, why is this text here? What is it meant to teach? What does the writer want to say through this passage? How ought I to take this? Figuring it out can be tough. Now, I was going to take an overall example and go into 2 Kings 6, 1-7, the little axe head story, but I think for purposes of time, I'm going to skip that and go directly to some of the clues that we can use in order to get at the writer's intention, because I want to be able to survey some of those clues. There are clues, I think, that help us get at the writer's intention, and I want to highlight some of those. We won't do all of them possibly, but we will try to highlight a number of them. Number one, intention may be explicitly declared. Intention may be explicitly declared, maybe right there in the top of the table. He tells you why he's writing it. You're used to that. 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1-24 or 1-15. 1 Kings 12 is a sample of that. That's a story about how Rehoboam receives a challenge from some of the tribes of Israel, the northern tribes, and from Jeroboam, about lightening the burden that his father Solomon apparently put on some of the on the Israelites. And they wanted Rehoboam's regime, if he was going to be king, to lighten the load and so on. And so Rehoboam was considering this. And if you remember this story in 1 Kings 12, Rehoboam consults with his father's advisors, and they say, well, you cut them a break and so on, they'll serve you forever. Give them some space on this one, and so on. He consults the young bucks that grew up with him, and they said, well, if you're going to be king, you better act like a king and don't let them push you around, etc., etc. So answer them harshly, lay your weight on them, and that sort of thing. That's the essence of it, and so on. And then you remember how the northern tribes then split when Rehoboam gave them that answer. But you notice when you get down to 1 Kings 12:15 that you have the intention of the passage clearly set before you, or of the situation. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by Yahweh, that he might fulfill his word, which Yahweh spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now that word that he spoke to Jeroboam is back in chapter 11, verse 31, that he was going to tear the kingdom from Solomon and he would give 10 tribes to Jeroboam. But you see, you don't have to worry, in one sense, about what the situation and the text is meant to teach or what's intended here. It tells you in verse 15, it was a turn of affairs, or you could call it a twist of Yahweh. A turn of affairs brought about by Yahweh, that he might fulfill his word. Now there's where the emphasis lies. You see, this can help you then, because your very first moralistic reaction might be, aha, that's just like a what a baccalaureate sermon, huh? They just don't listen to older and wiser heads, do they? It's always their peers that they're listening to. What a disastrous way to go about it. No, don't go there. That's not the teaching point. The teaching point's in verse 15. It was a turn of affairs brought about by Yahweh, that he might fulfill his word. The point's on the sovereignty of Yahweh, not on the stupidity of Rehoboam. The point is that sovereignty uses stupidity. Yes, but get the point. It's a turn of affairs. It's a twist brought about by Yahweh. He's in control and He's fulfilling His word. Now you say, well, okay, but what do I do for application? Because I had it all worked out real neatly before. Well, you're going to have to work harder, aren't you, at it? And you're going to have to maybe get a little theological about sovereignty and responsibility and all those testy little things. Huh? But at least you're on the right track. And it's played out for you in black and white, or whatever kind of print your Bible has, in verse 15. Now, let's take another sample. Judges chapter 7, verses 1 to 8. This is the reduction of Gideon's army. Remember, they're camped at the spring of Harod and so on. And then in Judges 7:2, you read this. Then Yahweh said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give Midian into your hand, lest Israel boast themselves against me, saying, my hand has saved me. And so all who are afraid go home, and there's still 10,000 left. And Yahweh says to Gideon in verse 4, the people are still too many, etc. And then he has that little scheme whereby he cuts them down further, take them down to the water and let them drink. And finally he said, by the 300 lappers, I will save you. But did you catch your pants on the nail as you fell off the hermeneutical roof there in verse 2? Did you hear what he said? Because a lot of commentators don't. The people who are with you are too many for me to give Midian into their hand, lest Israel boast themselves against me, saying, my hand has saved me. That is the key to the whole episode. And so many people go right by it. And what do? Oh, they get down there to the water with the troops, and they say, aha, you see there. You've got some that just get down on their knees to drink. These kind of slobs, they don't care about anything except quenching their thirst and so on. But you've got this 300. They kind of, it's a little difficult to tell in the text exactly what, they apparently scoop up water and they lap it like a dog from their hands. See, they're keeping their eyes on the enemy. They're vigilant. And then the 300, that's the minority you can count on, and all that junk. That's not in the text. That's read into the text. As far as we know, it was a kind of an arbitrary action that the Lord imposed by which he was going to whittle down Gideon's army. And everybody keeps putting some kind of virtue on these 300 men. But you already had the key in verse 2. That's the keynote. It's not safe for Yahweh to trust Israel with success until he pares them down to utter weakness. The point is that God cannot trust Israel with success. And that is the intention that it's meant to teach. And that's scary, because once you see that, a searching application arises from this passage and that verse. Because it says, is it only Israel that will snatch God's praise from him? Why do many of us, and some of you will say, well, I don't think, well, you don't have to agree with me. I'm leaving town soon, so it won't matter. But why do many of us not have greater success, quote unquote, in ministry for Christ? Could it be because God can't trust us with it? I'm quite sure he can't trust me with too much. Oh yes, we would still say it was all of God, but we would strut when we say it. So this cuts very close. But there's the intention, and so often it can be missed, and it's right there. Now, second clue. Biblical theology can bring intention into focus. Biblical theology can bring intention into focus. Now, here, I think we'll look at some of the narratives, not some, a couple of the narratives in Genesis. But I want you to think, go back to Genesis 12, for instance, to begin with. And just starting there at the first of the so-called Abraham narrative, you remember the promise that Yahweh gives to Abram. And if you know, I call it the quad promise because it has 4 key elements in it. And you can look at it in Genesis 12, 1-3, and a little bit further down in that passage. It has 4 elements. The first is people. He says, I will make you into a great nation, verse 2. And then in verse 7, he says, to your seed I will give this land. The seed, the people are an element. The second element is protection or presence. It varies. But notice in verse 3, he says, I will bless your blessers, and the one despising you I will curse. That's the protection clause of the promise. Sometimes in some expressions, like in Genesis 28, it'll be couched in terms of presence. I will be with you wherever you go. But it's the same component. So we'll call it here the protection element. And then thirdly, a program. Last of verse 3, in you all the families of the ground will be blessed. There's a redemptive scheme. There's a saving plan that Yahweh has, that he's going to work through Abraham and his seed, and eventually going to bring that blessing coming up in the first chapter of the New Testament, where you see the line leads to Jesus the Messiah. And then fourth, there's a place element. He says in verse 1, you go to the land that I will show you. Or in verse 7, to your seed I will give this land, Canaan. God always wants to give his people a place, it seems. It's as if Yahweh is saying here to Abram, I go to prepare a place for you. He somehow likes his people to have a place, a home. And you have that. So people, protection, program, place. That's the quad promise. My point here about biblical theology, I'm just keeping it mainly in the framework of these narratives in Genesis, is that if you keep that quad promise in mind, and if it's in the back of your cranium, then as you come to different passages in Genesis and so on, it lights them up. And you say, oh, yes, that's about... There's a connection there. Let me give you a couple of examples of the way I think it keeps you from making wrong inferences. Look at Genesis 12, 10-20. You know the passage. They're in the land, and Abraham thinks they have to leave the land. They have to go to Egypt. Now, what's really wrong there, as it's, he asks Sarah, by the way, did you notice that beautiful thing in verse 12, verse 11? This is free. He was about to enter Egypt, and he said to Sarai, his wife, I know you're a woman beautiful in appearance. He says to his wife, I know you're a real doll. Now, do you know that those are the first words Abraham ever spoke in Scripture? Some of you could take a lesson from that. Now, anyway, here we are in this section, and what's going on? He has Sarah pass herself off as his sister, and technically, that was right. Genesis 20, she was a half sister, etc. But there was an intent to deceive there, apparently. But that's not the main problem. Don't use the text to scare your 8- and 9-year-olds in your Sunday school class about the danger of telling lies. Don't use this text for that. It's far bigger than that. What's the problem? Well, do you remember Genesis 12, 1-3? Hello, it's about he didn't believe the protection clause. I will bless your blessers, and the one despising you I will curse. It's not that Abram was stupid. He knew what would probably happen in Egypt, and it turned out pretty much as he projected. He just wasn't counting on an autocratic character like Pharaoh being interested in Sarah, etc. But here it is. What he should have done was say, now, Sarah, we're going into Egypt. This could be dangerous, and especially dangerous for a beautiful woman like you. But we have a promise, Sarah. Yahweh has given us a promise, a protection clause, and we have to lean it. But no, he works out his own scheme instead of leaning on God's promise. It's a fainting fit of faith. It's a faith failure. He had the promise, but he failed to rub it into his circumstances. Have you ever been there? Now, even though it was a faith failure, it's still a testimony of strong grace, isn't it? When you see in verse 17 that Yahweh brought plagues on Pharaoh's house and brought Abram and Sarai out. He's a God who doesn't let go of his servants, even in their foolishness. A sample of weak faith, but strong grace. That's an encouragement. But if you connect it to the quad promise, to the promise of chapter 12, then you get on the right track and you don't moralize that passage. Now, please understand, I'm not saying that lying is okay. I'm just saying that's not the central focus of that passage, right? Now, another passage, let's go to Genesis 25. Genesis 25 and verses 12 to 18, and then we'll take in 19 to 26. Genesis 25, verse 12. Well, let's just read some of this because most of us don't have this one memorized. These are the generations of Ishmael, or the Toledot, the things that come out of or followed from Ishmael. Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth: Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, and Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes, etc. Now, reading Ishmael's family doesn't exactly stir your devotional juices, but actually it should, because it declares that God is faithful to his promises of chapter 16, verses 10 to 12, where he told Hagar he would greatly multiply her seed, and he's beginning to do it. The promise of chapter 17, verse 20 to Abraham, where he said Ishmael would have 12 princes, and of 21, verse 18, where the promise to Hagar was that he would make of Ishmael a great nation. Now, this may seem dull, but what you're really seeing being fleshed out is the faithfulness of God in the detailed promises he made to Hagar of the non-covenant line. But then what I want you to see is, note how this family tree lights up what comes after, or maybe what comes after is more helpfully seen against this passage, because when you get into verses 19 and following, you have the Toledot, the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. Isaac prayed to Yahweh for his wife because she was barren, and Yahweh granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. You remember the twins, Jacob and Esau, were born, and so on. But now you note this, and notice what this tells you about verses 19 and following then, about Isaac's family. Because here in 25:19 and following, the people aspect of the prophet promise is coming up again, isn't it? And the problem is that the covenant people are not having any people. Because Rebekah's barren. For the first 20 years of marriage, she doesn't have a kid. And we're right back in Abraham-Sarah mode again. And it doesn't look like the people of God have a ghost of a chance getting a start in this world. And then you have the twins. But you see the contrast. Back up in verses 12 to 18. The non-covenant line is fertile. Verses 19 and following, the covenant line is fragile. And it's all the more stark when you see it in light of Ishmael's fertility and so on. But the covenant people are within a step of extinction. Is this not then a picture of how it often is with the life of the people of God in this world? I know I'm making a few steps and jumps here. But Christ's people look pretty fragile, flimsy, and few among the success stories of this age. And if the church is not impressive, don't gripe about it. Just say, so what else is new? So it's the quad promise, as I would call it, however, that alerts us to the major concerns of these texts and therefore keeps them on our screen so that we keep thinking of them. We keep that quad promise in mind, and it will open up so many of these passages in the narratives of Genesis. Try it out on Genesis 23. Sarah's burial place. Try it out on Genesis 24. Keep these things in mind. It'll open up passages again and again. So that was number 2. Biblical theology helps with intention. Number 3, repetition may betray intention. Repetition. Let's go to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus 1. As one sample of repetition and intention. Now, it's very quietly done, and I can't remember, maybe because I'm so old, but I can't remember if I grasp how long it took me to grasp this, but it's very easy to read through Exodus 1 and not get the point. But if you look carefully in verses 7, 12, and 20, 3 times there's something repeated. Not in exactly the exact same formulaic terms, but the same kind of thing. Look at verse 7. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Look at verse 12. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread, and so on. Verse 20, so God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. You say, oh, that's the promise of Genesis 12, and it was repeated, and so on. There's the seed promise. There's the people element of the promise. And here it is, very subtly, very quietly woven into the text of Exodus 1. But it's repeated, and you pick up the repetition, and you say, I think he may have a reason for emphasizing that here. Now, when you do that, and you look at the varied circumstances in Exodus 1, where this multiplication of the people take place. Look at the circumstances. Verse 7 sums up the first 6 verses. What's in the first 6 verses? Well, the passing of time and generations, and Joseph and all that generation died, and yet the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. So passing time doesn't diminish the promise coming true about the multiplied seed. And then you notice severe afflictions does not. Did you notice a nice little paradox in verse 12? The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread. That's something that the kingpins and head honyoks of this age haven't caught up with yet. There's a certain chemistry that goes on among the people of God that not even we can explain. But somehow, even though you crush them, you don't eliminate them. You see it there. And then you notice specific threats as well. That was through the midwives. You know, they were told, look, you need to do, if it's a boy baby, you need to do a post-birth abortion affair on them, and so on. And they refused to do that. And then it says, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. So there were specific threats. And still, the people multiplied. And then, of course, in verse 22, you have the current uncertainty, and there's no repetition of the promise there. It just says that Pharaoh made all his people a bunch of vigilantes, and they were all ordered, if they found a Hebrew baby boy, that they were to chuck him to the bottom of the Nile, and so on. So what will happen now? Well, who knows, you might say. But based on what had happened so far, at every point, at every kind of threat, Yahweh's promise stood firm. It's a sort of a Matthew 16, verse 18 in narrative form. I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So that's Exodus 1. But you watch the repetition. Now, let's take another sample of repetition. Let's think of Genesis 39. You remember Joseph's in Egypt and so on, sold down there. And when you get to Genesis 39, you notice, again, a repetition, but you notice there's a kind of a framing device as well for the whole chapter. You notice that you have two references to it in verses 2 and 3, and also at the end of the chapter in 21 and 23. What's the reference? It's the phraseology, and Yahweh was with Joseph, or but Yahweh was with Joseph. And you have it in 2 and 3, and 21 and 23. So what difference does that repetition make? Well, it keeps Potiphar's wife from being so alluring to you. Aren't we veering off track when we get into Genesis 39 and we try to teach on how to overcome temptation from this text? Now, perhaps not completely off. I'm not ruling that out. But aren't we missing the big point when we focus there? Because unlike Joseph, we have allowed Potiphar's wife to hermeneutically seduce us. We get so wrapped up with her that we don't hear the theology of the text in the repetition of the text. Yahweh was with Joseph. It's the presence of Yahweh that makes all the difference. Now, can you bring the temptation in? Certainly. But doesn't it make more sense to say, here is the keynote of the text. Yahweh was with Joseph. How was he with him? In his forsakenness, verses 1 to 6. In his temptation, verses 7 to 18. How else do you explain how he was able to refuse that temptation? And in his disillusionment, if you want to call it that, in verses 19 to 23. Seems to me that catches the keynote of the passage, and you do it because you've got that repetition that clued you about the intention. Now, test yourself on the matter of repetition. If you want to take up 2 Kings chapter 1 sometime, you can find that perhaps profitable, another example of it. Now, let's look, please, at Joshua chapter 2. As you go there, there's a fourth way in which you can catch intention, and it's this: literary shape may highlight intention. Literary shape may highlight intention. Joshua 2 is an example. Now, I think the writer of Joshua 2 is still asking the question, how can I make it any clearer? And he's very distraught. To get a sense of Joshua 2, let me draw a parallel to the sandwich. I'm not going to read it. It's a Rahab story. I'm assuming you're familiar with it. You can catch up on details later if you need to. But if you look, there are two pieces of bread at either end of the sandwich, right? And in verse 1, the first part of the verse, you have the commission by Joshua to the two spies. That's one hunk of bread. The other hunk of bread is in verses 22 to 24, where you have the spies returning to Joshua and reporting to him. So much for the bread. Now you have a couple of slices or slivers of lettuce in there. The first one is in verses 2 to 7. Or you have the arrival of the spies in Jericho. What's the big concern in verses 2 to 7? It's for the protection of the spies. You know, Rahab hides them and so on. The Jericho police force comes knocking at the door and all that. The protection of the spies is the concern, but it's their arrival. Then you have another sliver of lettuce in verses 15 to 21. That's where the focus is on the escape of the spies. Not their arrival, as in 2 to 7, but on their escape, verses 15 to 21. And what's the concern there? Well, not on the protection of the spies so much, but on the protection of Rahab and company when Israel comes into the land. You see how it's patterning. Then you get to the meat in the very center of the passage, verses 8 to 14, and that's where you have a confession of faith that Rahab makes in verses 8 to 14. Now, I think if you look at verses 8 to 14, you get a big chunk of theology. And you notice you really have a full pattern of what saving faith is. Look at let's pick up in verse 9. Rahab says, I know that Yahweh's given you the land, that the fear of you has fallen on us, and that the inhabitants of the land melt away before you, for we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, and so on. So there you have hearing a testimony, and she recites that testimony in verses 9 and 10. Then you notice it moves to forming a conviction in verse 11. She says at the last of verse 11, for Yahweh your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Forming a conviction. But notice it doesn't stay there. In verses 12 and 13, it goes to seeking a refuge. Now then, please swear to me by Yahweh that as I've dealt kindly with you, that you also will deal kindly with my father's house, etc., and that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and so on, deliver our lives from death. She just doesn't have a doctrinal faith about who Yahweh is, verse 11, but she also seeks to come under His sheltering mercy. So it's hearing a testimony, it's forming a conviction, and it's fleeing to that God to be sheltered from His wrath to come when that comes through the Israelites, so on. But that's her confession of faith. It's right in the center, deliberately. And you say, well, okay, so it can be in the center, but that doesn't, well, look back at verse 7, and you notice how he leaves you hanging on a rope at the end of verse 7, because it says the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. And as a reader, if you really pay attention when you read the Bible, as you should, you begin to have all sorts of angst at that point. And you say, how will those guys ever get out of Jericho if they shut the gates? It's as if the writer says, don't you worry your head about that. Here, get a load of this. Listen to verses 8 to 14. And then you notice he gives you your literary role aid in verse 15. You find out that Rahab's house was somehow built into the wall, and she could let them down that way. And you say, oh, that's how they get out. But you see, he keeps you suspended because he says there's something more important you need to hear. Now, the writer of Joshua, though, has been tearing his hair for years because Christians read Joshua 2 and they immediately wonder about Rahab's lie to the Jericho police force, and they tangle themselves up in an ethical dilemma. I'm not saying you don't need to touch on that at some point, but why do we always go there first? And the writer is saying, I thought I shaped my story so they would hear Rahab's truth. But they seem to get all hung up on her lie. They're not hearing what I want them to hear. They've gotten the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Now, that's the literary pattern. Please understand, I think this can be overdone. You can go to journal articles and you can see literary layouts of biblical passages, and they're so long and complex that you just despair. They're no help. But sometimes it can be helpful to see how it's packaged, because sometimes the writer gives you a clue as what he wants you to focus on. And I think it's helpful here. Now, let me give you another example that you can check out yourself. 1 Samuel 27 to 29. This is not so much the structure of it as the literary packaging. But you'll have to go do your own work on it. Look at the geography, especially the geographical references in 1 Samuel 27 to 29. But just very briefly, David, in 1 Samuel 27 is with the Philistines serving Achish, king of Gath, and he gets into a dilemma because the Philistines are going to go into a major assault on Israel. And Achish, who has been so duped by David, says, you know that you and your men are going to go with me when we fight Israel. So what does David do now? If he's found marching with the Philistines against Israel, if Israel knows this, he can kiss his chances of being covenant king goodbye. Big dilemma. But then you notice that it doesn't tell you how David gets out of that dilemma until chapter 29. In between, there's chapter 28. And what's chapter 28 about? Chapter 28's on something that takes place on the night before the big battle. And Saul goes to consult a medium in Endor. You know why he does that? Because God does not answer me in any way, shape, or form. He's been cut off from God, does not speak to him, and so on. Now, if you had to write chronological order, it would be chapter 27, chapter 29, chapter 28. But you notice as you read it and look at the geography, chapter 28 actually came later, but the writer has for some reason placed it right up against chapter 27. Now, why did he do that? I'm convinced that he did that because he wanted you to compare the two dilemmas of these protagonists. What's David's dilemma? He is with the enemies of God. That's a heavy. What's Saul's dilemma? He's without the word of God. Some dilemmas are worse than others. You see where you pick that up? You pick it up because you pay attention to the literary packaging. And it's a solemn note, isn't it? We can have our troubles and we think, how will I ever get out of this? This is more than I can handle. But some troubles are worse than others. What if you're in the outer darkness, as Saul was? That's a real dilemma. See? So, watch the literary packaging. Now, number 5, and this will be my last one for those of you who want to know when relief will come. Number 5, keep an eye on the strange stuff. Keep an eye on the strange stuff. By that, I mean hermeneutical burning bushes. By that, I mean, you know how the burning bush aroused Moses' curiosity in Exodus 3. He just had to go check it out. Sometimes you have passages like that just, well, they baffle you, they mystify you, but it's sort of like trying to figure out whether the girl you're dating really likes you or not. It's such an exquisite agony. And you just can't quite leave it alone. And that's the way, sometimes a passage takes you and you can't figure it out, and you come back to it later and you still can't figure it out, but you just can't let it go. It's just too fascinating. I say, keep an eye on that strange stuff. Now, what about that strange stuff? Well, look at the end of Ruth chapter 4, and you know where we're going, verses 18 to 22. The genealogy at the end of the book of Ruth starts with Perez, ends with David, and so on. Now, how's that for the end of a book like Ruth, which is a very interesting book, but for a closer, what a disappointment, huh? The begats rise again. And it picks up, of course, Perez was mentioned in chapter 4, verse 12 by the elders and so on in the city gate, and the blessing that they uttered on Boaz and so on. So, and then you have Perez then in the beginning of this genealogy that takes you back to Genesis 38, doesn't it? And Judah and Tamar. And then it ends, the genealogy or family tree ends with David, which in verse 22, which takes you, shall we say, to 2 Samuel 7 anyway, and the covenant king. The genealogy takes you long before Naomi, and it takes you long far after Naomi to David. It's as if it's saying this. It's not a disappointment. I don't think it is. It's as if this little family tree says we must look at the story of Naomi and her affliction in light of the perspective of the coming of God's kingdom. Get the big picture. And what's Naomi's segment of that kingdom story? It's in chapter 4, verse 21. The words, Boaz fathered Obed. That's sort of summary for what happens in the book of Ruth, right? Naomi's segment of the kingdom story. Of course, Naomi could never know how God used her affliction in bringing his kingdom into this world under David. She could not see it at the time. But at least for us, here's a grand perspective, is it not? That we must grasp. Sometimes the Lord takes up the stories of our afflictions and troubles, and he inserts them into the establishing and the coming and the maintaining of his rule in this world. That's where it ends up with David there as king. Now, I think, too, there's a certain balance in this, isn't there, while we're on it? The genealogy here at the end of the book links up with the rest of the book, doesn't it? And tells you something very fascinating, I think, about Yahweh our God. Because, well, let me come at it this way. I'm in a PCA. And I remember, not recently, because I'm not looking for a job now, but I remember we used to, ministers, if they were looking to change churches or something like that, they would have their ministerial data form on file in Atlanta, MDF, for those in the know. And you would fill that out. There are all sorts of questions and so on. One of them went something like this, are you task-oriented or people-oriented? Now, that's a minefield, If you say task-oriented, you'll say, oh, he doesn't care about people, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to nuance answers to that, I suppose. But you see here in the book of Ruth, if we could put it this way, that Yahweh is both task-oriented and people-oriented, right? Because you look at the bulk of the book of Ruth, and you see that Yahweh is the God who binds up the brokenhearted. And you look at the genealogy at the end, and you say, and he is the God who establishes his kingdom on this earth through his covenant king. He does both. What a God he is. So, I hope you can see that. That's one of those hermeneutical teasers. There's another one you might think of. You don't need to turn there, but it's in Joshua 24 and verses 29 to 33. Joshua 24, 29 to 33. It's what I call a grave ending to the book of Joshua. And these are not junk lines, though. These are not anticlimax. Sometimes you think of something like this because you have three obituaries, basically. You have Joshua, you have the bones of Joseph, and then you have Eliezer, the priest who all three die, and so on. And you sometimes think, oh, these are just the shavings on the workshop floor that the biblical writer is sweeping up to kind of neaten things up, you might say, before the end of the book. But it's not. It's not anticlimax. Because what's it say about where these men were buried? And by the way, this isn't the only theological point of this little section of the book, but what's it say about Joshua? It says he was buried in Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim. What's it say about the bones of Joseph? They were buried in Shechem. What's it say about Eliezer the priest? The ESV isn't the best here. They buried him at Gibeah of Phinehas, his son. Gibeah of Phinehas, Phinehas Knob. I know that we tend to think that Washington and London and maybe Benghazi and Damascus and so on are the important spots. But for the writer of the book of Joshua, the places you need to pay attention to are Timnath-Serach, Shechem, and Phinehas Knob. Why? Because these three men are buried there. Oh, so what? That's in the land. Hello, chapter 1, verse 3. That's what the Lord promised to give to Joshua and to Israel. And these 3 men are buried in promised dirt. Is God faithful or what? Stand and sing the Gloria Patri. And that's just one of those little side passages that you get caught on and you say, wonder why this is here. And after you sit on it a while, it begins to feed your soul. Now, there are other clues we can discuss, but these 5 must suffice. So, in tracking down intention, though, there is one item of first importance that I would leave with you, and that is a matter of general orientation when you're reading Old Testament narrative. If you keep your eye on God, on what He's doing in the text, on what He's promising, on what He is working, on what He's revealing about Himself. In short, if you keep looking for what Psalm 27 calls the beauty of the Lord, you will be near gold dust. It's what I call the God-centered, or if you want the 50-cent word, the theocentric focus that opens up the text. In short, it's not about me. Didn't say it doesn't apply to you. It said it's not about me. Let me just pull it together with an anecdote. There was a book that Christian Focus put out, What the Bible Means to Me. And it's just a collection of very short testimonies from various people about what the Bible means to them. So it's all sorts of variety in it. There's a woman, Rebecca Davis, who's a writer in I think, Greenville, South Carolina, who included a part of her experience. And this is what Rebecca Davis says. I was studying the Psalms, taking copious notes. If this was God's message to me, then you'd better believe with all the determination I could muster, I was going to understand it. I wanted the Word of God to be my greatest delight. So I kept getting up early, studying, learning, and glad to be doing it. Honestly, though, it never even crossed my mind to ask God to open my understanding. He'd given me a brain, and that's what I was using. After all, didn't somebody say that I shouldn't ask God to do for me what He'd already given me the ability to do for myself? Then I came to Psalm 22, the one all about Jesus dying on the cross. And the sad fact is that I wasn't interested in studying it. I knew why. I knew exactly why. It was because it wasn't about me. Almost every other psalm so far had been, in my mind, I would emphasize that phrase, about me. But I knew this one was important, and I knew it wasn't about me, and I knew that I wasn't excited about reading it. You need a change in orientation. So it's when that we find this God, as Psalm 43 calls Him, who is our exceeding joy. He must be not only our exceeding joy in worship, but our exceeding joy in biblical interpretation. May it be so. Thank you.